Hello everyone. As far as today's agenda is concerned, we will talk about few Azure interview questions. So first of all, we need to understand what exactly Azure is and what's the reason behind us understanding and talking about these interview questions. So Azure is a pretty hot topic these days. It's a part of Microsoft Cloud. A lot of people who are listening to this particular webcast would have been might have heard of AWS is there. Then we talk about Google Cloud is there. There's one from Microsoft which we are talking about. So there's a huge potential as far as cloud is concerned, and the market is huge. The market is hot these days. So if you talk about this particular interview session, the question and answer session, I would say rather, not interview. So this covers two major courses in Azure. One is 533 and one is 534. So 533 is for admins and 534 is for architects. So when you talk about admins, the people who are responsible for managing and doing the run and maintain every day on Azure. So the questions in this particular slide would focus on that, and at the same time, few things related to the architecting part, right? So there is another course also from Microsoft itself, which is 532. We will not focus much on 532 because that talks about, I would say, programming. So how do you use Azure, I would say, services in order to put your services, I would say, your applications on Azure. So that basically focuses on that. So we would not talk much in terms of that. So this will again focus on 533 and 34. So now when you talk about cloud computing, a lot of different people have different definitions of cloud computing. So now cloud computing is something which is not very new technology, I would say. The terminology is new, but the technology is not. The first product I would say which was talking about cloud was my Hotmail, which was designed and developed by Sabir Bhatia. So I'm sure a lot of people listening to this webinar would be aware of that particular name. So what he did was he designed a mail server. So in that particular mail server, I used to go ahead and access my mails, right? So that mail server was in the cloud, and then I was connecting to that mail server remotely to access my mails. So that makes it a cloud product, right? So now when you talk about cloud computing these days, the definition has changed. But as far as the working is concerned, it remains pretty much the same. So now when you talk about this, we talk about that we use and pay, right? So pay per use is the kind of model what we talk about. So we basically use and then pay only for that amount of, I would not say data, but I would say services which we use. So there's an explanation down there in the slide. It talks about, it is the use of servers on the internet to store, manage, and process data. The difference is instead of using your own servers, you're using somebody else's server to do the task and pay them for the amount of time for which you use them, right? So this is what the idea is. So pay per use is the model which we focus on when we talk about cloud computing these days, right? So this is what cloud is. This is what a basic definition of cloud is. If you search the internet, you will have more than, I guess, 100 plus definitions on cloud. Now, as far as definitions on cloud are concerned, it's up to you which one you would like to adapt and which one you would like to go with. But then it works with a single model, which is pay per use. So when you use, you pay. If you don't use, you don't pay. And end of day, you're using somebody else's resources. No, you're not using your own resources, and you're only paying for their resources, what you use. Okay. Now talking about different types of services, which we talk about as far as my cloud is concerned. So there are three major things what we talk about, which is IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And there are other things like somebody has talked about DAAS, database as a service. Then you talk about SES. So that is for my mails. But then majorly we categorize these into three types. One is IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So IaaS talks about infrastructure as a service, and you get the hardware in that from the cloud provider as a service. So say for example, you want to go ahead and deploy a machine, deploy a server. So basically when you talk about that particular scenario, you are basically putting a server in IaaS, which is my infrastructure as a service. So you get complete control on a virtual machine, which is there in the cloud hosted by Microsoft, Google, or AWS. And then you can just go ahead and put in your resources onto that particular machine. So this is how it works, right? Simple enough. Then you talk about PaaS, platform as a service. So in this, you don't get access to your machine, or in other words, you can say you don't get access to the underlying layer, but you get complete access to the resources or the services, right? So it's more like my platform on which you publish your applications or you put your application. There are a few examples. So I talk about my web apps, my mobile apps, which are in Azure. Then you talk about the last type of service offered in cloud. So this is my SaaS. So when you talk about SaaS, you get software as a service in Azure. So you don't need to worry about infrastructure. You don't need to worry about platform. So you basically are getting the end product, which may be running on the infrastructure, which may be running on the platform. So for example, when you launch a VM on Azure, if you talk about OS, you're not buying the OS. And if you talk about PAS, you're not buying the service. So you're just basically paying for the software, which is running on either IaaS or either PAS. So this is what we get as far as my types of cloud is concerned. Now let's just jump on to another question. Now, what are the different cloud deployment models? So explanation talks about three models which we have. One is my public cloud, one is my private cloud, and one is my hybrid cloud. So let's just take this with examples. So I am a general user, I'm a home user. I want to go ahead and put a website. So I decide that my website will be hosted on my cloud, right? So I want to go ahead and deploy a VM on the cloud, and I want to put my website over there. So I go to Microsoft website, Azure website, I sign up there, and then maybe you can say provision a machine. Once I provision a machine, I put IaaS on top of it. Once I put IaaS on top of it, I will just go ahead and move my resources. When I say move my resources, move my application on the cloud. So what I'm trying to say is a general basic end user who is sitting at home can log into the cloud, get a machine, and then use a machine, right? So this is what my public cloud is. So it's available for the public, right? Then you talk about the private cloud. Now, as far as private cloud is concerned, it's owned by the enterprise, okay? And only enterprise people will have access to it. So organizations like Accenture, or maybe Wipro, or maybe Capgemini, Cognizant. So all these people own a private cloud, right? So the idea is that the resources are owned by them, and hence their people are the ones who will go ahead and access that. But then at times, what happens is they give access to their private cloud for their customers also. Now you might have a question that why do I build a private cloud? Because end of the day, I'm spending a lot of money on infrastructure, I'm spending a lot of money on air conditioning, electricity, and I'm spending a lot of money on licensing also. So why can't I just go ahead and work on public cloud? Why do I need to go ahead and implement a private cloud? Now, basically, when you talk about a private cloud is built for automation. So that is one of the most important things. And the second important part when we talk about is that when you talk about private cloud, it gives me more control over the resources. Whereas when you talk about public cloud, I do not have control over the resources because everything is owned by the vendor, right? Now talking about hybrid cloud. So I'll give you an example for this also. I go to Amazon, and Amazon is my public cloud provider. And I tell them that I need a private cloud. So would it be possible for you to host a private cloud for me? So Amazon says yes. And they dedicate a list of resources for me, only for my organization. So now when you talk about Amazon, Amazon is hosting a public cloud, but then they also are capable enough of hosting a private cloud for my organization. So that makes it a hybrid cloud. So this is what hybrid cloud means. So these are three different ways of how I categorize these cloud models. Now, few other questions. Now, the question says, I have some private servers on my premises. Also, I have distributed some of my workloads on the public cloud. What is the architecture called? When you talk about this kind of scenario, so we talk about my virtual private network. So these are my options, basically, virtual private network. Then we talk about private cloud. Then we talk about my virtual private cloud, and then you have hybrid cloud, okay? Again, so just read the question carefully, and then probably I'll just jump on to the next slide and we will talk about the answer and the explanation. So again, I would say I have some private servers on my premises. Also, I have distributed some of my workloads on the public cloud. What is this architecture called? Okay. So now it says hybrid cloud. So when you talk about this type of architecture would be on a hybrid cloud. Why? Because we use both public cloud and the on-premise server, which is on the private cloud. Now let's just jump on to the next question. So we have a few general Azure questions. Now, these are Azure specific. The questions which we did talk about previously were just general cloud questions, right? So if you are giving an interview for maybe Azure, maybe AWS, or maybe Google, so those 4 questions are something which I would say, go with any of the scenarios, any of the interview which you would do. Okay. Now these are specific general Azure questions. So when I say specific general Azure questions, so we talk about only Azure in here. Okay. So the first question talks about what is Microsoft Azure and why is it used? Okay. So as I initially said, that Azure is my public cloud from Microsoft. So let's just see how it works. So we have a definition on the next slide. Okay. So as discussed above, the companies which provide cloud services are called cloud providers. And of course, I did explain you this in the previous slide. I mean, the first slide which we talked about. So I explained you about Google. So that is a cloud provider. I explained you about AWS. That is a cloud provider. And then I talked about Azure, which is a cloud provider. So now Azure is from Microsoft. And the idea behind this is it's more like my public cloud. So you can go to Azure, you can log on to Azure, create a machine, and then start working on that. So this is one of the cloud providers. So Microsoft is one of the cloud providers, one of the major cloud providers these days, right? So this is what my Azure is. Now talking about which services in Azure is used to manage resources in Azure. So we have few options. I have my application inside. I have my ARM, which is my Azure Resource Manager. Then you have my Azure portal. Then you have my log analytics. Okay. So as far as this is concerned, so we talk about my ARM. So this is a service which is basically on the newer portal, right? So now when you talk about these services, which is on the newer portal, so it is used to manage the infrastructure which involves a number of Azure services. It's basically my fabric. So I'm not sure how many people are aware of what is an Azure fabric, but then the idea behind this is that when you talk about my Azure Fabric now runs on something called ARM. Previously, in version 1 of Azure, it was using the service management model. So now this is a new thing, right? So when you talk about managing the resources in Azure, so we basically talk about my resource manager model and then how services run on it, how they work, and how they interact with each other. There are a lot of things which you need to work on and which you need to learn as far as my ARM is. But for the time being, you just need to remember that we talk about my Azure Resource Manager. So this is something which runs everything and takes care of a lot of different things as far as my Azure is concerned. So when ARM came, a lot of different things started coming in. So tag was one of them. Resource groups was another one. So if you are familiar with resource group, great. If you're familiar with tags, great. If you're not, just go to Google and search for it and you'll find your answers. Okay. Then we have few questions. Which of the following web applications can be deployed with Azure? Okay. So we can, of course, put ASP.NET applications in Azure. Now you might have a question, where exactly I can use these applications or where exactly I can deploy the applications. So to answer that, you can deploy it either in IaaS or you can deploy it either in PaaS, right? So you can, of course, deploy ASP.NET, you can deploy PHP, you can deploy WCF. So the answer is all of the above. But then it's very important for you to understand that if there is an application which is on Java, so that may have few problems when you deploy it on Azure, right? Because of course, Azure is majorly designed for Microsoft services, okay? Now, when you talk about these Microsoft services, Java is not a Microsoft product. So it's more like, it's not that friendly when you compare it with other services which we are running in the cloud, okay? Specific to Microsoft Cloud, of course, I would say. Okay, jumping on to the next one, then few other questions. So these are my fill in the blanks. A dash role is a virtual machine instance running Microsoft IaaS web services that can accept and respond to HTTP or HTTP request. Okay, so we have 4 options in here. One is my web, one is my server, one is my worker, and one is my client. Okay, now when you talk about this, the answer to that is web role is something which is basically hosted on a virtual machine and is running on Microsoft IaaS web server, and that is capable of accepting HTTP and HTTPS request. So basically on the web role, what you do is you can upload your website and your website runs on top of it. And then of course, you know that my website works on HTTP and HTTPS. So hence my web role is the one which is capable enough of running that particular maybe application or software or web services. Okay. The other question what we talk about is what is the use of roles in Microsoft Azure? So when you talk about what is the use of roles, we talk about three roles. One is my web role, one is my worker role, and one is my VM role. Okay. So now when you talk about my web role basically is for hosting and deploying my websites. Okay. The worker role is the one which basically helps the web role to execute the background processes. The example I can give you is my web jobs. I'm not sure how many people are aware of web jobs, but if you want, you can again search on the internet. So my web role is residing on worker role. Worker role is the one which supports my web role, and the worker role is the one which actually resides on my VM role. Okay. So this is the one which talks to the underlying layer. It's more like a framework. It acts as a framework. So that means on the operating system, I have my worker role. On top of it, I have my web role. So my web role is the one which will host my services. I would not say services, but the applications rather. Okay. So jumping on to the next one. Now the question says, is it possible to create virtual machines using ARM in a virtual network that was created using classic deployment? And of course, I don't think so. It's possible. So let's just see. This is not supported, as I said, because ARM is something different. And previously, the classic portal was using a different model of deployment. So it used my classic model of deployment, which was basically for service management. And if you're aware of the two portals, you'll see there's a huge difference in how classic portal was and how the new portal is. So there's a huge difference in terms of that also. So it's not possible. Jumping on to the next question, what are virtual machine skill sets? So scaling up, scaling down. So if you're not aware, if I have more number of requests coming in, my virtual machines have the capacity and capability to scale up and scale down based upon schedule and performance. Okay. So in other words, what I can say is if my CPU is spiking to 100%, or not 100%, I would cap it to 90. So if my CPU is spiking to 90 and my requests are still coming in for accessing that portal, the web portal, maybe you can say, which is running on this particular machine. So my scale set is intelligent enough to scale one more instance and then load balance the traffic between the two instances, which are now deployed running the same set of application. Okay. So this is what my skill set does. It automatically auto scales, I would say, rather, the workloads, right, based upon the performance and the schedule. Now, how this schedule thing works. So say, for example, if starting from morning 9 to evening 9, you have more number of visitors on the website. So you can scale more number of instances for your website. And after 9 p.m. at night, you can minimize the number of instances, right? So this is how my skill set works. Okay, jumping on to next question. Are data disk supported within scale set? So now, first of all, when you talk about this, yes, of course, my data disk are supported in scale set. Okay. So when you talk about this, a scale set can be defined as attached data disk configuration that applies to all VMs in the set. So there are a few types of data disk examples which I've given over there. So one is, of course, my Azure files, which is my SMB shared disk. And then you have my OS drives, then you have my temp drives, then you have my Azure data services, like the blobs are there and tables are there and cubes are there. And then you have my external data services, such as remote databases. So all of these are supported. All of the disks are supported, which you see over there. Talking about availability set. So do scale sets work with Azure availability set? Now, first of all, you need to understand what is an availability set. Availability set is basically grouping of servers so that I can load balance the information among those servers. So that is done for high availability. And there is something called fault domain and update domain as far as high availability is concerned. So fault domain says that if I have two VMs in same availability set, both the VMs will share the common power source and common network. Okay. As far as update domain is concerned, so update domain talks about that if I have, say for example, 10 VMs and I would keep the value of update domain to 2, so I will have sets of 2 to each, right? So I'll have a group of 2 to each, right? And at a given point in time, if Microsoft needs to perform a planned maintenance, only one update domain will go down at a given point. So this is what my update domain means. So now, does it support my availability set? The scale set supports my availability set. Yes, the scale set supports my availability set. And you can just go ahead and fetch some information about the availability set if you're not very much well versed with availability sets as far as my Azure is concerned. Okay, and there is a small description also over there. So I'll just read that for you. Yes, a scale set is an implicit availability set with 5 fault domains and 5 update domains. Okay, scale sets of more than 100 VMs span multiple placement groups, which are equivalent to multiple availability sets. Okay, so this is what it means. And then I would just skip the other part because I've given you enough explanation for this. And I would definitely recommend that you read availability set. Okay, now the question is, what is a break fix issue? Break fix issue is a technical problem, which is like your environment is running and then all of a sudden a problem comes, right? That is a break, and then fixing that particular problem is my fix, right? So technical problems are called break fix issues. It is the industry term which refers to work involved in supporting a technology when it fails in the normal course of function, which requires intervention by a support organization to restore the service. Okay, so this is what break fix is. Now, it's not specific to Azure actually. It's just a common term what we use as far as my services are concerned. So even if I talk about on-premise networks, so we still talk about break fix issues, right? So I'm not sure how many people have got a chance to call Microsoft and open a support case in case you have issues with any of the things in your environment. So those issues are basically my break fix issues. Jumping on to next question, why is Azure Active Directory used? Okay. Now, when you talk about Azure Active Directory is used for identity and access management, first of all. And it's a PaaS-based service. Azure Active Directory is a PaaS-based service. Now, it is used to grant access to employees to specific products and services in your network. So there are a lot of examples, Salesforce.com, Twitter, right? I can give you a few more examples, Office 365, Intune, which are two different products from Microsoft. So they work with Azure Active Directory, right? Now, Azure AD has some inbuilt support for applications in the gallery, which can be added directly. Okay, so there is a gallery, and then you can just go ahead and add support for Azure Active Directory to any application which is available in the gallery. Okay, talking about a few other questions regarding Azure AD. What happens when you exhaust the maximum failed attempts for authenticating yourself via Azure AD? Okay, so we have a more sophisticated strategy to account lockout, which is based on IP of the request and the password entered. Okay, so now when you talk about on-prem, we talk about account lockouts. So if you enter incorrect passwords more than 3 times, so your account is logged out, and it will be unlocked after maybe 15 minutes or half an hour or 1 hour based upon how your administrator has configured it. Now the same thing happens in Azure AD, but then it happens based upon the IP address. Okay, so it will go ahead and track the IP address of the request and the password entered, and the duration of the lockout also increases based upon the likelihood that is in the attack. Okay, so this is how it works when we talk about maximum failed attempts for authenticating yourself. Okay, jumping on to the next question. Where can I find a list of applications that are pre-integrated with Azure AD and their capabilities? So when you talk about this, my Azure AD has around 2,600 pre-integrated applications, and all pre-integrated applications support single sign-on. Single sign-on lets your organization credentials to access your apps. Some of the applications also support automated provisioning and deprovisioning. So there's a gallery, you can just go to the gallery and then you can get a list of applications which are available for using my Azure AD. But of course, that is not the complete list of applications which are available, which you can use as far as this is concerned. There are a huge number of applications which are supported by Azure AD. Okay. Of course, single sign-on is one of the components of Azure AD. So probably in case you're not aware of single sign-on, you can just go ahead and do some research on that. Now, talking about the next question, how can I use applications with Azure AD that I'm using on-prem? Of course, you can do that. Now, my Azure AD gives you an easy and secure way to connect to the web app that you choose. You can access these applications in a way you can access your SaaS-based applications in Azure AD. So you don't need to have a VPN installed. Okay, you can just go ahead and install a component, and then you are ready to go. You can use the applications which are there on-prem. A few examples I can give you is you can use your SharePoint, you can use your web apps for which the servers are installed on your premises, and you would like to use Azure AD for authentication. So you can do that for sure. Now the question, important question, very important question. What is the Azure Fabric, Service Fabric? So when you talk about that, my Azure Service Fabric is a distributed system platform that makes it easy to package, deploy, and manage scalable and reliable microservices. Okay, so this is the guy which actually controls your network, your storage, and your compute. Okay, which are basically the most critical components of my cloud. So if my fabric will not be running in the backend, so nobody will be assigning IP addresses, nobody will be assigning resources, and nobody will be assigning the storage. Okay, so this is the guy which actually runs everything, I would say, in the cloud infrastructure, right? Okay, let's go further. Service Fabric also addresses the significant challenges in developing and managing cloud applications. Developers and administrators can avoid complex infrastructure problems and focus on implementing mission-critical, demanding workloads that are scalable, reliable, and manageable. Now, my Service Fabric represents the next-generation middleware platform for building and managing these enterprise-class Tier 1 cloud-based applications. Okay. Now, what is VNet? VNet is basically nothing but my virtual network. So VNet is a representation of your own network in the cloud. It logically isolates your instances launched in the cloud from rest of the resources which you have in the cloud. So this is my whole network based on which my configuration of machines depend. I mean, the subnets, the address space depends on, right? Talking about few other things, what are the differences between subscription administrator and directory administrator? So when you talk about the subscription administrator is the one which is responsible for the complete subscription. Now, by default, only one subscription administrator role is assigned in Azure. A subscription administrator can either be a Microsoft account or either can be your work account. And that guy has control over the complete Azure portal and the services which run on that. Okay. If you want, you can just go ahead and sign up more accounts, which are basically subscription administrator, and these people are my co-admins. Now, as far as the Azure AD is concerned, so the account which we set up over there for identity and access management, so we talk about my Azure AD administrator, the directory administrator. So let's just read this. Azure AD has a different set of admin roles to manage the directory and identity related features. These admins will have access to various features in Azure portal or the Azure Classic portal, and the admin roles determine what they can do, like create or edit users, assign administrative roles to others, and so on. So this is what my Azure AD administrator does. Are there any scale limits for customers using managed disk? Managed disk eliminates the limit associated with storage accounts. Now, first of all, you need to understand what is a managed disk, right? When you create a machine now, these days, you will have an option over there that you want to use managed disk or unmanaged disk, right? So when you select managed disk, Microsoft manages, I would not say Microsoft, but then the Azure Fabric manages all your disk, right? So a disk which is assigned to VM will be managed by Azure. Okay, so this is what my managed disk is. Now, using my managed disk, I basically eliminate the limit associated with my storage account. However, the number of managed disk per subscription is limited to 2000 by default. Okay, so you can have 2000 managed disk in Azure subscription. Now, talking about what is the difference between service bus queues and storage queues. Now, the Azure storage queue is simple and the developer experience is quite good. It uses the local Azure storage emulator and debugging is made quite easy. The tool for Azure storage queue allows you to easily peek at the top 32 messages, and if the messages are in XML or JSON, you'll be able to visualize their content directly with the Visual Studio. Furthermore, these queues can be purged of their content, which is especially useful during the development process, the QA efforts basically. And as far as my service bus is concerned, so the Azure service bus queues are evolved and surrounded by many useful mechanisms that make it enterprise worthy. They are built into service bus and are able to forward messages to other queues and topics. And they have built-in header message queue and messages that are timed to live, that has control. Hence, messages don't automatically disappear after 7 days. So if you talk about this, probably you'll have to go ahead and read about what is a service bus queue and my storage queues. So I talk about my storage queues, which are a part of my storage itself. If you're not aware of storage, storage has 4 types of storage. One is my blob, one is my files, one is my queues, and one is my tables, right? So you need to have more information of what my storage queues is. Okay, now talking about what is Azure Redis Cache. So Redis is an open source in-memory data structure store used as a database, and then you talk about cache and a message broker. So when you talk about my Azure Redis cache, that is based on the popular open source Redis cache. It gives you access to secure dedicated Redis cache managed by Microsoft and accessible from any application within Azure. It supports data structures such as strings, hashes, lists, sets, sorted sets with a big range of queries, bitmaps, hyperlogs, and indexes with radius queries. Okay. Another question we talk about is, why does not Microsoft Redis Cache have an MSDN class library reference like some of the other Azure services? Now, of course, when you talk about this, this is an open source, one very important thing. Now, my Microsoft Redis Cache is based on the popular open source Redis Cache and can be accessible by a wide range of Redis clients. And that is the reason we cannot just go ahead and put it into MSDN. Okay. So simple enough, just remember that. Because each client is different, there is not one centralized class reference on MSDN. So we cannot just restrict it, maybe you can say, right? So this is the reason we do not have any MSDN class library for my Redis cache. What is my Redis databases? So Redis database are just a logical separation of data within some Redis instances. The cache memory is shared between all the databases, and actual memory consumption depends on the key values stored in the database. For example, a C6 cache has 53 GB of memory, and you can choose to put all 53 GB into one database, or you can split it into a multiple set of databases. Then you have another question, why was my client disconnected from the cache? Okay. Now when you talk about this, the following are some common reasons for cache disconnect. Now my client side causes the client application was redeployed. The client application performed a scaling operation. In the case of cloud services or web apps, this may be due to auto scaling. The networking layer of the client side changed. Then you have transient errors occurred in the client or in the network node because of the client and the server. The bandwidth threshold limits were reached. CPU bound operations took more long to complete, and then you have my server side issues also, few of the server side issues also. On the stand cache offering, the Azure Redis cache service initiates a failover from the primary node to the secondary node. Now Azure was patching the instances where the cache was deployed, and this can be the Redis server updates or general VM maintenance. Then you have what is Azure Search. So simple enough, Azure Search is a cloud search as a service solution that delegates server and infrastructure management to Microsoft, leaving you with a ready-to-use service that can populate with your data and then use to add search to your web or the mobile application. So it works with REST API or .NET SDKs, of course. Few other questions. My web app still uses an old Docker container image, and I have updated the image on Docker Hub, which is basically the new portal what we talk about. So we are basically talking about container services. Do you support continuous integration deployment of custom containers? Now, first of all, for private registries, you can refresh the container by stopping and starting the web app, or you can change or add a dummy application setting to a force and refresh of your container. So this is what you can do. Now, talking about few things, what are the expected values for startup file section? And I configure the runtime stack. Now for JS nodes, you specify PM2 configuration file or your script file. For .NET Core, specify your compiled DLL name. For Ruby, you can specify the Ruby script that you want to initialize with your app. Okay. How your Azure Marketplace subscription is priced. So we have these models. One is monthly fee, so pay as you go kind of thing. Usage based. Then you have free software. So Microsoft gives you a free subscription. So free subscription is valid for a period of 1 month, and you get approximately $200 in that. So you can use that. Then you have the free. So this is for the customers who are not charged marketplace fee for use of the offerings, the Microsoft offerings. And you have BYOL, bring your own license. Okay. So these are the subscription models, basically how these are priced, you can say. So jumping on to the next one. What is the difference between price, software price, total price in the cost structure for virtual machine offerings in virtual machine? So let's just see. Price refers to the cost of Azure virtual machine to run the software. Software price refers to the publisher software running on the virtual machine. Total price refers to the combined cost of these two. Simple enough. I don't think so. You need to get more details of this because it's very simple. Price of VM, software price, total price. Total price is equal to price of VM plus software price. Now, the other question talks about what are stateful and stateless microservices for Service Fabric. So Service Fabric enables you to build applications that consist of microservices. So stateless microservices such as protocol gateway and web proxy do not maintain mutual state outside a request and its response from the service. Now, my Azure Cloud Service Worker role is an example of a stateless service, and my stateful microservices such as user accounts, databases, devices, shopping carts, and queues maintain a mutual authoritative state beyond the request and its response. So this is how it works. Now, what is an application partition? Okay. Now, when you talk about the application partition are a part of Active Directory system, and having said so, they are directory partitions which are replicated to domain controllers. So usually domain controllers that are included in process of directory partition hold a replica of the directory partition. Now, maybe you can read some more information. My domain controller has 4 types of partition. One is configuration, one is schema, one is my domain partition, and then you have my application partition. So all the information related to the application goes in the application partition. So it actually again has nothing to do with the cloud, but then it's always good to know, because if you're designing and developing an application on the cloud, you can just go ahead and put that information in the application partition on the Active Directory server. But then it's very important for you to understand that we should have an Active Directory server up and running fine in the cloud. Okay. So these were few of the questions what we talked about as far as my interview questions are. Thank you all, and you have a great day ahead.